Lost Boys of Pickering, a Canadian tragedy. A night of celebration turns ominous. It was the early hours of St. Patrick's Day, 1995, a cold, dark Friday morning on the shores of Lake Ontario. In the suburban community of Pickering, Ontario, a group of 6 teenage friends had spent the night at a lively basement party, celebrating the start of spring break. They laughed, drank, and enjoyed their teenage freedom. Shortly before 1 a.m., with the party winding down, the boys grew restless and hatched a spontaneous plan for a late-night adventure. They told a friend they were going to goof around on a boat, just some harmless fun in the water to cap off the night. None of them could have known that within hours, they would vanish without a trace, sparking one of Ontario's most haunting unsolved mysteries. These youths would later become known as the Lost Boys of Pickering. 30 years later, their fate remains unknown. This is the true story of that night, the exhaustive investigation that followed, the theories that have emerged, and the enduring anguish of their families. Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast. It's a gripping true crime podcast uncovering unsolved murders, disappearances, and forgotten crimes from Ontario and beyond. Told with deep research, compelling storytelling, and a voice for the victims. Join us today, where every clue could lead to answers, and every case deserves a second look. Six friends vanish on Lake Ontario. The 6 missing boys were all local high school friends, ranging in age from 16 to 18. They included Jay Boyle, 17, Chad Smith, 18, Robbie Rumboldt, 17, Jamie Lefebvre, 17, Michael Cummins, 17, and Danny Higgins, 16. Jay, Chad, and Robbie lived in Pickering. Jamie was from nearby Scarborough, Michael from Oshawa, and Danny from Ajax. But despite coming from different corners of the Toronto suburbs, the boys were close friends who'd come together that Thursday night. Jay Boyle was most well known in the group. Tall and muscular, he had been a star baseball pitcher in junior high, known for a blazing fastball. Jay was also a young father. He lived with his girlfriend Monique and their baby daughter Kira, and he'd had a few run-ins with the law, facing some minor assault and weapons charges at the time. Yet to his family, Jay was a loving son and brother. Funny, outgoing, and someone who loves his family and friends, his mother Patricia would later say, noting that he was always willing to stand up for those he cared about. The other boys were typical teenagers of their era, into sports, music, and hanging out with friends, looking forward to adult life just around the corner. None of them could have imagined that March 17, 1995, would be their last day seen alive. Sometime around 12:50 a.m., 6 boys left the house party together, excited and likely a little tipsy from the beer and liquor they'd been enjoying. Outside, the early spring air was frigid. Lake Ontario's waters were still icy cold, capable of inducing hypothermia within minutes. Despite the chill, the teens were intent on an adventure. They headed down toward Frenchman's Bay and the Pickering waterfront, where several marinas docked boats along the lakeshore. The sprawling Pickering Nuclear Generation Station loomed nearby in the darkness. To reach the open lake, the boys would have to slip past the shallows of the nuclear plant as they exited the bay. Undeterred, the group broke into 2 different marina yards under cover of night. In one, they found a 14-foot imitation Boston whaler motorboat and decided to take it. In another, they had earlier boosted a 3-wheeled paddle boat, essentially a large water tricycle, the night before. They also scavenged a case of beer from one boat they checked, extra fuel for their joyride. Around 1:48 a.m., a grainy surveillance camera at East Shore Marina captured what would become the last known images of the boys. On the footage, 3 figures can be seen entering the marina's service area and moving toward the docks. Later, the families identified these 3 as Jamie Lefebvre, Robbie Rumboldt, and Michael Cummins. The other 3 boys were not caught on camera, possibly because they were at the other marina or just outside the camera's view. The video did not explicitly show any boat theft in progress, but it placed at least half of their friends at the marina in the critical time frame. By approximately 2:30 a.m., nearby residents along the bay reported hearing the roar of a boat motor out in the dark water. One can imagine the 6 teenagers, giddy with liquid courage, starting up the stolen motorboat and whooping as they set off into the vast lake, perhaps towing or carrying the paddle boat along with them. The sound of that engine in the early morning hours was the last anyone would ever hear of the boys. After that, the lost boys of Pickering disappeared into the darkness. When dawn broke on March 17 and the teens failed to return home, parents and friends grew concerned. These were the days before every teenager carried a cell phone. There was no easy way to track down the boys once they'd gone off on their own. By mid-morning Friday, word was spreading among the parents that none of the 6 had shown up at home. In fact, Chad Smith's mother later revealed that the boys had set out from her house that night. They left from the Smith home and never returned. The family's worry quickly turned into panic. 2 of the boys' girlfriends, who had been at the party as well, reportedly phoned Durham Regional Police around 3:30 a.m. in the middle of that night, when they first realized the boys were missing and possibly out on the lake. However, according to later accounts, the officer on duty dismissed their concerns, suggesting the teens were probably not in any danger, and instructing the girls to have the boys' mothers file missing persons reports in the morning if they were still gone. In essence, first cry for help was met with a shrug. No immediate search was launched in those critical early hours. Meanwhile, on that same Friday morning, staff of the marinas discovered evidence of a break-in. 2 boats were found missing, the small whaler motorboat from East Shore Marina and the big paddle boat from a neighboring marina. At first, this theft was likely seen as a separate vandalism incident. It would take more time before police put 2 and 2 together. All of Friday passed with frantic parents calling friends and relatives, searching for any sign of the boys. Yet there was none. By Saturday, March 18, a full 36 hours after the boys were last seen, authorities finally mobilized a massive search. Someone would realize that the missing boats and the 6 missing teens might be one in the same incident. At 2 p.m. that Saturday, an extensive air, water, and land search effort kicked off. Durham Regional Police were joined with the Coast Guard and the Toronto Police Marine Unit, and even a Canadian Forces Hercules C-130 aircraft and a search and rescue helicopter from CFB Trenton were deployed to scour Lake Ontario from above. The shoreline, bay, and open waters were combed for any trace of the teens or the vessels. Scores of volunteers from across southern Ontario also poured in to help, driven by empathy and the terrifying mystery of 6 boys lost at once. A search in vain, not a trace to be found. Despite the massive search operation, nothing was found. No overturned boat, no debris, no bodies, no clothing. None of the usual flotsam one might expect after a boating accident. The search teams were baffled. It was as if the lake had swallowed 6 young people and 2 boats whole. The only tangible clue turned up in the days that followed was a single red gas can. On March 29, 1995, about 12 days after the disappearance, a fisherman on the American side of Lake Ontario spotted a 5-gallon gasoline canister bobbing in the waves near Wilson, New York. The canister was identified as the type used by the missing Boston whaler boat, and authorities believed it likely came from the boys' stolen boat. Wilson, New York lies roughly 60 kilometers across the lake from Pickering, directly south of Toronto. The drift of that gas can to U.S. waters was a strong indication of the lake's powerful currents, a grim sign that the missing boat may have capsized and spilled its contents. Aside from that single gas can, no other evidence was recovered. As one local paper later noted, no bodies, no pieces of clothing, no boat were ever found. The disappearance was complete. From the beginning, investigators leaned toward a theory of a tragic accident. Durham police concluded that teenagers had indeed stolen the boat from East Shore Marina and taken it out on Lake Ontario, where they likely ran into trouble. The small open boat was not designed for the cold, choppy lake conditions at night in March. The boys had no life jackets and probably little boating experience. The police surmised that the overloaded boat capsized, sending all 6 teens in the near-freezing water of Lake Ontario. In water that cold, just above freezing, hypothermia would set in within minutes. The boys could have lost muscle function and drowned very quickly, perhaps in as little as 15 to 20 minutes. It's a plausible and deeply sad explanation. 6 carefree young men, gone in an instant due to one night's reckless decision. But if that's what happened, why was nothing found? Normally, even in a drowning scenario, some evidence eventually surfaces. Bodies, especially, tend to rise to the surface after a time, and debris from a boat might wash ashore. Lake Ontario is vast and deep, but it's not the ocean. People expected that at least one of the 6, or some remnant of the vessels, would eventually be discovered. As weeks turned into months and then years with zero trace of the boys, families struggled to accept the official theory. The case took on an eerie aura. In the media, the missing boys were soon dubbed the Lost Boys, a moniker that evoked the sense of them being frozen in time, forever teenagers who simply vanished into thin air. For the families, the pain of not knowing was excruciating. One by one, each boy's loved ones had to come to terms with the strong possibility that their son or brother was never coming home. Yet without evidence of death, how could they ever truly be at peace? Patricia Boyle, Jay's mother, refused to give up hope easily. Jay's girlfriend Monique had to raise their baby daughter Kiara alone, but the Boyle family made sure Kiara grew up knowing who her father was. We have tried to keep Jay's memory alive through his daughter. He was a baby when he first went missing, said Jay's sister Amanda years later. Every year, on Jay's birthday and on the anniversary of his disappearance, the Boyle family would remember him. It's hard. It's really hard, Amanda told a reporter, describing how the uncertainty made it impossible to move on. Still, she said, the family kept faith that someday police would catch a break and find out what happened to Jay. The other families echoed that sentiment, a desperate desire for closure. As one relative put it, it's been almost 20 years. We have nothing. We just want closure. They had watched the lake for years, wondering if it held their boys' bodies, or if some clue might surface. Candles were lit at vigils. Prayers were said. Every passing year without answers was torture. Up next, the investigation and early missteps. The investigation and early missteps. As the initial search efforts failed to find any trace, the investigation by Durham Regional Police Service came under quiet scrutiny. It later emerged that there were significant delays and lapses in the early response. Those 2 girlfriends who called police at 3:30 a.m. on March 17, while the boys were likely still out on the lake, were basically brushed off. The officer who took the call, identified as Constable James Gillum, allegedly told the girls that unless they knew a specific location to search, there was nothing police could do in the middle of the night. He did not log it as an official missing persons report. In fact, no formal report was filed until 6 days later, on March 23, 1995. By that time, the trail was beyond cold. It was as if those crucial first days had slipped away with no sense of urgency. This delay outraged the families as they learned of it. If the authorities had acted immediately upon the first calls, could the boys have been rescued? It's impossible to know, but a lost opportunity haunts everyone. Even once DRPS realized a connection between the missing boys and the stolen boat in March 18. Their theory was fixed on an accidental drowning. The case was not treated as a tragic misadventure, not a potential crime. And indeed, it might well have been exactly that, but some felt the police wrote it off too quickly. The parents and friends of the boys were adamant that something more could have happened, or at least that every lead should be exhausted. One point of contention was security footage from the marina. Early in the investigation, police did obtain the surveillance tape from East Shore Marina that had captured 3 of the boys at 1:48 a.m. Family members were allowed to view a snippet of this tape in 1995, and they confirmed seeing Jamie, Robbie, and Michael on it. However, when the families later asked to see the video again, that request was denied. Why? The police had already gleaned what they wanted: confirmation the boys were at the marina, and perhaps they felt there was nothing more on it. For years, the full content of that surveillance tape remained a mystery, outside of law enforcement. Eventually, through Canada's access to information laws, a copy of the entire 16-hour tape was obtained by a determined independent investigator. What that tape revealed raised new questions about the thoroughness of the original investigation. A private investigator's pursuit. New clues emerge. In the mid-2000s, as the 10th anniversary of the disappearance passed with no answers, some of the families sought outside help. Enter Bruce Ricketts, a licensed private investigator. Ricketts took on the case around 2010, driven by sympathy for the families and fascination with the mystery. He worked pro bono for over a decade, doggedly compiling documents, interviewing witnesses, and digging into leads that law enforcement seemed to have let go cold. Ricketts even authored a book about the case titled Lost Boys of Pickering: What We Know and What We Believe, in which he separates the proven facts from his own theories. One of Ricketts' most significant contributions was obtaining and analyzing that marina surveillance video in full. When he got the footage from DRPS, he sat through all 16 hours of grainy tape, much of it likely uneventful nighttime recording. But in doing so, he discovered something the police summary hadn't mentioned at all. On the tape, approximately 21 minutes after the boys appear, Ricketts noticed 3 other individuals coming into frame. At about 2:09 to 2:10 a.m., a young man and 2 young women walked across the marina lot, near the area where the boys had been. The video quality was poor, too grainy to see faces or clear detail. But Ricketts observed a strange moment. The male in this trio suddenly moved ahead of the 2 females, then turned back and extended his arms as if pointing something at them. It was an odd gesture. Whether he was pointing toward the water, aiming a flashlight, or even a weapon, it was impossible to tell in the old tape. The presence of these 3 people right after the boys were there is potentially critical. I was very much surprised, Ricketts said, of seeing the newcomers on the footage, noting that their appearance at 2:10 a.m. falls squarely in the timeline when the boys were at the marina. The implication? These 3 could be witnesses who saw or heard something relevant. Perhaps they heard the boys revving the boat engine, or even saw the direction they headed. What did they see or hear? Ricketts wondered aloud. DRPS files released to him contained no mention of these individuals. It seemed this lead was never pursued back in 1995. Ricketts made a public plea to identify the mystery trio. These 3 persons are potential witnesses to what happened that night at the marina. Could shed a crucial light on this case, he urged. He set up an email tip line and used social media in an attempt to find them or anyone who knew them. To date, however, they remain unidentified. The revelation of their presence fuels suspicions that not every lead was followed by the original investigation. Ricketts uncovered other irregularities too. He noted that at 2:21 a.m., not long after those 3 people were seen, the most important security camera, the one covering the docks, suddenly shut off. Whether it was a technical failure or something more deliberate is unknown, but it meant that a key window of time went unrecorded, right when the boys would presumably have been launching or boarding the boat. It's a crucial piece of information we lost, Ricketts lamented of the camera outage. To a former military man like Ricketts, a detail about his background as he mentioned in interviews, such gaps and oversights were frustrating. Over the years, Bruce Ricketts became the central champion for the Lost Boys case. He gave numerous interviews to local media, often criticizing how the case was handled. In 2018, spent days sharing his findings with the Pickering News advertiser. There's too much hidden here. There's too much not being said, Ricketts argued, insisting that the official story left many unanswered questions. He questioned why the Durham police were so quick to conclude drowning without concrete proof, and whether bias might have played a role. It's true that a couple of boys, notably Jay Boyle, had minor scrapes with the law and a bit of a troublemaker reputation. Ricketts wondered if some authorities had written them off as delinquent kids, and thus didn't put full effort into the investigation early on. In his view, the slow response and later stonewalling seemed like payback by a police service that perhaps had a strained relationship with one or more of the boys. This is speculation, of course, but it speaks to the mistrust that grew between the families and the police over the years. Families felt left in the dark, and Ricketts at times seemed to be the only one still actively trying to solve the mystery. Up next, theories and rumors. What could have happened? Theories and rumors. What could have happened? In the absence of definitive evidence, the number of theories have swirled around the Lost Boys of Pickering case. Over the decades, family members, investigators, and amateur sleuths have all pondered scenarios, ranging from the straightforward to the fantastic. Here are the most discussed possibilities. The tragic accident. The official theory. The primary theory, as noted, is that the boys' outing ended in a boating accident. A small stone boat, likely overloaded with 6 people and possibly a heavy paddle boat in tow, could have easily capsized once they reached the open waters of Lake Ontario. A freak wave or simple imbalance in the boat could toss everyone into the freezing water. None of the teens were wearing life jackets as far as anyone knows. In the dark and cold, they would succumb quickly to hypothermia or drowning. The lake's depth, up to 80 plus meters in that region, might then claim the sunken boat and the bodies. It's possible the boat took on water and went to the bottom intact, trapping evidence with it. Such cold water, sometimes bodies do not resurface. The formation of adipocere can preserve a body underwater indefinitely, or they become ensnared in wreckage. The lake could literally be holding all the answers beneath its surface. The discovery of the gas can near Wilson, New York supports this theory. Currents may have carried loose debris far across the lake. It's a heartbreaking scenario, but one that aligns with known facts, and it remains the official stance of law enforcement. Foul play or confrontation. Other theories speculate that something more sinister befell the boys. One idea is that they might have stolen the wrong boat, perhaps a vessel that was being used for illegal purposes like drug smuggling, or owned by someone dangerous. For instance, if the boat had contraband stashed on it, unbeknownst to the teens, those responsible might have chased the boys down. A Reddit commenter once theorized, some drunk kids unknowingly take a boat from a marina that has some product on it. The owners can't call the cops because of the product, so they go out looking for it themselves, find it, and take care of business. In this hypothetical scenario, the boys could have been met with violence out on the water, perhaps ran by another boat on purpose or even harmed on shore, and their bodies disposed of to cover up another crime. This kind of theory ventures into murky territory with little concrete evidence, but the complete lack of physical evidence does make some wonder if a cover-up occurred. Could the boat have been deliberately sunk somewhere else or dismantled? Did someone remove floating debris from the water before it was found? These are unanswered questions. Notably, the unidentified trio seen in the marina video at 2:10 a.m. fuels speculation of a possible confrontation. Who were those three? Friends of the boys? Random late-night wanderers? Or part of some clandestine meetup? We simply don't know. What we do know is that they didn't report seeing the boys, at least not publicly, even after the disappearance made headlines. If they witnessed an accident or altercation, they have never come forward. Ricketts strongly believes these three could shed light if located. An elaborate runaway or prank gone wrong. In the immediate aftermath, some locals wonder the teens might have pulled off a prank or planned disappearance, essentially running away. This theory is largely considered far-fetched. The idea was that perhaps the boys wanted to disappear for a while, maybe to avoid troubles at home or, in Jay's case, upcoming court dates, and that stealing the boat was a way to fake their deaths. Could they have slipped away to start new lives somewhere? The notion sounds like something out of a movie, and there's zero evidence the boys planned such a thing. They left behind wallets, clothes, their cars, and in Jay's case, a child. Nothing that suggests planning for a new life. Friends say these boys were not distraught or seeking to escape their lives. Police looked into sightings and leads across Ontario and even out of province, in case the teens had fled, but nothing panned out. As the Mysteries of Canada article bluntly put it, if it was an elaborate plot to just disappear, it's held up without a single crack for decades. Highly unlikely in a group of 6 young people. All indications are the boys fully intended to come back after their joyride. They even left a mess of empty bottles and party litter at the house, expecting to return and probably deal with cleanup later. Sadly, they never did. Cover-up or stonewalling by authorities. This is less a theory what happened to the boys, more an explanation for why we don't know what happened. Some, like Ricketts and members of the community, have insinuated that authorities did not handle the case properly, perhaps deliberately. The reasons postulated range from embarrassment over the slow response to a desire to avoid negative publicity to even more nefarious suggestions. One fringe idea that occasionally surfaces links the case to the nearby nuclear plant. To reach Lake Ontario, the boys would have passed close to the Pickering nuclear generating station's property. Could plant security have encountered the boys and overreacted, concealing an incident? There's no evidence of this, and the plant has never reported anything unusual that night. It's an example of how, in a vacuum of facts, speculation can run wild. More plausible is the idea that early mistakes, like ignoring the girlfriend's call, made the police defensive. Ricketts' difficulty in obtaining information, and the families being refused a second view in the video, led to a perception of stonewalling. The police insist that they conducted a thorough investigation and simply found no evidence of foul play. Yet Ricketts would often counter. How thorough could it have been if basic leads, like the 2:10 a.m. mystery trio, were overlooked? I think it will take reopening the entire case, a reevaluation of all the evidence, Ricketts said in frustration, pushing for an independent review. Over the years, there have been calls to reinvestigate with fresh eyes, but no official cold case reinvestigation has been publicly announced by Durham Regional Police Services. Other outlandish theories. Inevitably, the case is perplexing, a few bizarre theories have popped up. One anonymous commenter even claimed that the boys were victims of a human trafficking ring, lured away and smuggled into the United States or elsewhere. The story is almost certainly baseless. It reads like pure speculation from someone inserting themselves into the narrative. The commenter bizarrely mentioned Epstein's Island, which set off alarm bells of internet fabulism. There is no credible evidence that the teens were abducted or alive beyond March 17, 1995. In the era before social media, 6 Canadian boys disappearing internationally would have been extremely difficult to pull off unnoticed. Similarly, theories about a serial killer boat driver or other far-fetched plots have no supporting facts. They arise from the single perplexing truth. 6 people vanished, and nothing was found. Faced with that, the imagination can run wild. But nearly all investigators, official and private, circle back to either accident or an unplanned foul play encounter as the only realistic possibilities. The Niagara remains. A glimmer of hope fades. One development that raised hopes of a breakthrough came 3 years after the boys disappeared. On April 10, 1998, 2 sets of human remains were recovered from the Niagara River, near the intake channel for the Sir Adam Beck power generating station in Niagara Falls. One set of remains was particularly intriguing. They were partial remains encased in a pair of red Levi's jeans. This detail electrified the families, because on the night he vanished, 17-year-old Jay Boyle was wearing red Levi's jeans, a memorable part of his outfit. Could this finally be an answer? Jay's remains had somehow drifted down Lake Ontario and into the Niagara River, which flows out of Lake Erie into Ontario. Not a typical path for something from Pickering side of Lake Ontario, but conceivable if caught in complex currents or transported. It might explain at least one of the lost boys' fates. The discovery of those red pants was the closest thing to evidence the families had seen in years, and they anxiously awaited forensic testing. Unfortunately, the wait would be long and the results inconclusive. It took more than 5 years for the various police agencies to coordinate and complete DNA testing on the recovered jeans and the remains. Those years were agonizing for the Boyles. When the tests were finally done, the result was definitive. The DNA did not match Jay Boyle. They got a significant amount of DNA from the jeans, but it didn't match my brother, Jay's sister, Siobhan, Boyle said, her disappointment palpable. The remains in the red Levi's turned out to belong to an unknown man, identity still undetermined, but not one of the 6 Pickering boys. The Niagara River clue had been a heartbreaking false lead. As Siobhan put it, all the family was left with was ongoing uncertainty. For the families, the outcome was mixed. On one hand, they still had no closure. On the other, a small part of them was relieved that the grisly find hadn't turned out to be their loved one. But it meant they were back to square one. As of today, none of the lost boys' bodies have ever been located. That 1998 discovery remains the only time any human remains were even suspected to be connected to the case. It's a testament to how utterly complete the disappearance was. Up next, media coverage and lasting legacy. Media coverage and lasting legacy. In the aftermath of the boys' disappearance, the story made headlines across Ontario. The idea of 6 teenagers vanishing at once was shocking and newsworthy. Local newspapers like the Toronto Star and Globe and Mail ran initial stories in a massive search and the subsequent mystery when nothing was found. TV news crews descended on Pickering's Frenchman's Bay and the days after March 17, filming the search boats and interviewing anxious parents on the shore. For a time, the Lost Boys were front-page news. But as weeks passed and no answers emerged, the media coverage began to wane. When no crime scene, no suspect, and only an assumption of accidental drowning, the story unfortunately lost the hook that keeps the media's attention. It settled into the category of a haunting local legend, remembered every so often, but not constantly in the headlines. Yet the families and community did not forget. Anniversary stories became a staple of local media in Durham region. On milestone anniversaries like the 5th, 10th, 20th years, newspapers would check in with the families, recount the known facts, and remind the public that the case remained unsolved. For example, on the 19th anniversary in 2014, Jay Boyle's family gathered and spoke to CTV News Toronto about their continued hope, which coincided with their petition to have the Niagara remains tested. You live your life by his birthday, the anniversary, Amanda Boyle said, describing how each passing year is marked by the loss. Such interviews were gut-wrenching, showing that even 2 decades later the pain was fresh. In the 2010s, TrueCrimePodcast and online forums picked up the story of the Lost Boys, introducing it to a new generation. Reddit threads dissected the timelines and clues. YouTube creators like Stephanie Harlow recount the case in detail. Podcasts such as Crime Junkie and Crime Family discussed it as one of Canada's great unsolved cases. The rise of social media also allowed the families and supporters to start dedicated pages. A Facebook group titled Lost Boys of Pickering was created to share updates and keep the memory of the boys alive. Private investigator Bruce Ricketts was active on that page, sharing his findings and encouraging anyone with information to come forward. One point and outcome of the case's notoriety was the support network it generated. Other families of missing persons in Ontario reached out to the Lost Boys' parents and siblings, offering understanding and solidarity. The community realized that these 6 teenagers' story was not just a tale of youthful misadventure, but also one of how important it is for authorities to respond swiftly when people go missing, even if they're troublesome teens, even if alcohol is involved. The case underscored the notion that every moment counts in a potential search and rescue, and any delay can cost lives. In Pickering, the legacy that night prompted some calls for better safety measures at marinas, such as more security of patrols during spring break, though ultimately it's hard to guard against a determined group of youth bent on a prank. In recent years, coverage has tended to focus on Bruce Ricketts' contributions and any new information he unearthed. In October 2022, for instance, local news outlets reported on Ricketts' discovery of the 3 unknown individuals and the surveillance tape in his appeal for new witnesses. This cast the old story in a new light and briefly reignited public interest. For the first time in ages, there was something new to talk about in the case. That same year, 2022, a Canadian author published a book that delved deeper into the mystery. In fact, this was likely Ricketts' own book, as he had announced one in the works. Interviews with him revealed his deep personal investment. He spent 13 years doggedly pursuing the truth for the families. Tragically, Bruce Ricketts passed away on January 2nd, 2024, after an illness. He died without seeing the case solved. The families mourned him as a true advocate, who became like a member of their own families. With his death, activity in the Lost Boys of Pickering Facebook page fell quiet, a sobering reminder that time is taking those who remember the boys intimately. As of 2025, some of the boys' parents are aging into their 70s and 80s. They still long for answers, but they also fear they may not live to see them. "We just want closure, that's all," one father was quoted as saying years ago, a simple plea that has gone unanswered for far too long. Where the case stands today. Today, the disappearance of Jay, Chad, Robbie, Jamie, Michael, and Danny remains an open cold case. Officially, the Durham Regional Police have never charged anyone or identified any crime in the matter. The case is classified as a missing persons incident, with the presumed cause being a boating accident. On paper, the file may read unsolved, but internally, the authorities have long since accepted that the boys likely perished in Lake Ontario. However, no body, no case, as the saying goes, and so the 16s are still listed in police databases as missing. In fact, the case is indexed in Canada's National Missing Persons Database, RCMP case number 199 6000260, showing that all 6 are still unaccounted for. Leads still trickle in occasionally. Over the years, there have been sporadic tips. A fisherman who thought he saw a submerged boat on sonar, divers checked and found nothing. Or a person claiming to have overheard a bar conversation, implying one of the boys was alive in another province. Those leads went nowhere. Modern advances, like sonar mapping and underwater drones, have been suggested as tools to perhaps finally locate the boat on the lake bottom, if indeed it's down there. But given the enormous search area and depth, such an effort would be like finding a needle in a haystack. Durham police have not announced any new searches of that kind, likely due to the cost and slim chances of success. The families continue to commemorate their boys. Every year on March 17, they have gathered at the Frenchman's Bay Marina, the last place the boys were seen, to light candles and toss flowers into the water. It's a somber reminder that for them, this isn't just a mystery or a story. It's deeply personal and painful. There are now nieces, nephews, even grandchildren who never met these 6 young men, but know their names by heart because they are spoken of so often. Jay Boyle's daughter, Kiara, who was an infant in 1995, is now an adult in her 30s. Her existence is a living legacy of her father. One can only imagine how it feels for her, having grown up always wondering what happened to Dad. The Lost Boys of Pickering case stands as one of the most baffling cold cases in Canadian history, simply due to the number of people who disappeared together. It's a case that raises as many questions about how we investigate missing persons as it does about the fate of those specific boys. Over the years, it has prompted discussions about police accountability, cross-border cooperation, since the gas can was found in U.S. waters, and the importance of keeping cold cases in the public eye so that tips come forward. Durham Regional Police maintain that if anyone has information, they would like to hear it. It's never too late for a witness to come forward. They can be contacted, or tips can be given anonymously via Crime Stoppers. For the families, any scrap of information is better than the void they've lived with. I think we'll take reopening the entire case, Bruce Ricketts had said, urging a fresh start. Where that ever happens officially remains unclear. As of now, the story of the Lost Boys of Pickering remains a cautionary tale and a heartbreaking saga in equal measure. It's a story of youth and impulsiveness, of families enduring the unendurable, and of a mystery that has stubbornly refused to yield to time. Conclusion: an enduring mystery. In the final analysis, we are left with the image of those 6 smiling boys, frozen in time in their mid-teens, eternally missing. We picture them piling into that little boat in a chilly night, full of laughter and bravado. We imagine the thrill and terror they might have felt out in the dark waves of Lake Ontario. And then, nothing. Silence. An empty lake at dawn. The question hangs in the air. What really happened out there in the early hours of March 17, 1995? 3 decades on, the Lost Boys of Pickering have not been forgotten. Their story continues to be told on podcasts like this, in articles and books, and in the memories of those who love them. Perhaps one day a fisherman's net will snag on something, or a drop will lower the lake to reveal a piece of wreckage, or a long guilty conscience will compel someone to speak. Until then, the fate of Jay Boyle, Chad Smith, Robbie Rumboldt, Jamie Lefebvre, Michael Cummins, and Danny Higgins remains an open question. What is certain is the impact their disappearance has had. It has bonded the community in grief, inspired persistent efforts by people like Bruce Ricketts, and served as a sobering reminder of how precious and fragile life can be. In the words of one family member, spoken with equal parts sorrow and resolve, we just want closure, that's all. The case of the Lost Boys is a cold case that still burns in the hearts of many. Until the day those families get the closure they seek, we will keep telling this story, keeping the memory of those 6 boys alive, and hoping that someday, somehow, the truth will surface from the depths. Because every case deserves answers, and every victim deserves justice. Subscribe now to Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's True Crime Podcast. Episodes available wherever you get your podcasts.